The morning of September 8th, 2022, started like any other day at Balmoral Castle in Scotland. The Queen was in her favorite retreat, surrounded by the heather-covered hills she loved so much. Charles had been worried about his mother's health for months. At 96 years old, she had been showing signs of slowing down, but her spirit remained as strong as ever. Charles was at Dumfries House, his sustainable living project in Scotland, when the call came. His private secretary's voice was calm, but urgent. The Queen's doctors were concerned. They recommended that the family should come to Balmoral immediately. Charles felt his heart sink. He had always known this day would come, but nothing could have prepared him for the reality of it. The drive to Balmoral seemed endless. Charles sat in the back of his car, watching the Scottish countryside blur past. His mind wandered to countless memories with his mother. He remembered being a young boy, following her around the palace gardens. She would point out different flowers and tell him stories about the history of each plant. Even then, she was teaching him about duty and responsibility, though he didn't realize it at the time. He thought about the times when she had to be both mother and monarch. There were state dinners where she would catch his eye across a crowded room and give him a small, encouraging smile. There were private moments when she would offer gentle guidance about his future role. She never made it seem like a burden, always presenting it as a privilege to serve the people. When Charles arrived at Balmoral, the atmosphere was heavy with unspoken worry. His sister was already there, having been with the Queen that morning. The Queen had insisted on carrying out her official duties, meeting with the outgoing Prime Minister Liz Truss just 2 days earlier. Even in her final days, duty came first. The doctors briefed the family quietly. The Queen was comfortable, but her condition was serious. Charles went to her bedroom, where she lay peacefully. She looked so small in the large bed, but her eyes still held that familiar spark of intelligence and warmth. They spoke quietly about simple things, the weather, the gardens, the Highland cattle she enjoyed watching from her window. As the afternoon wore on, more family members arrived. William rushed from Windsor, and Harry flew in from California. The Queen seemed aware of everyone's presence, though she was growing more tired. Charles held her hand, feeling how fragile it had become. These were the same hands that had signed thousands of documents, shaken hands with world leaders, and comforted him as a child when he had nightmares. The evening brought a strange calm to Balmoral. The Queen slept peacefully, surrounded by her family. Charles sat beside her bed, thinking about all the conversations they had never had. He wished he could tell her how much her example had shaped him, how her dedication to service had inspired his own charitable work. He wanted to thank her for showing him how to balance being human with being royal. As night fell over the Scottish Highlands, Charles realized that this was likely their last night together. Tomorrow, everything would change. He would no longer be the Prince of Wales waiting for his turn. He would be king, carrying on the legacy his mother had built over 7 decades. The weight of that responsibility felt enormous, but her presence gave him strength. The Queen had always told him that monarchy was not about personal desires, but about serving others. She had shown him this through her own life, sacrificing personal preferences for public duty. Now, as he watched her sleep peacefully in her beloved Scotland, Charles understood that his greatest tribute to her would be to continue that tradition of selfless service. The castle was quiet except for the gentle sounds of the Scottish night. Charles knew that whatever happened in the coming hours or days, this moment would stay with him forever. His mother, the woman who had been the constant center of his world for 73 years, was giving him one last lesson in grace and dignity. She was showing him how to face life's most difficult moments with quiet courage and acceptance. The morning of September 8th brought an unusual stillness to Balmoral Castle. Charles had barely slept, staying close to his mother's bedside throughout the night. The Queen's breathing had become more labored, and the family knew the end was near. Charles found himself remembering the promise he had made to her years ago, that he would carry on her work and serve the Commonwealth with the same dedication she had shown. Dr. Douglas Glass, the Queen's physician, spoke with the family in hushed tones. The Queen was peaceful and not in pain, but her time was limited. Charles felt a strange mixture of grief and privilege. How many sons get to spend these precious final moments with their mother? How many people get to say goodbye properly? Around midday, Charles took a walk in the castle gardens with his sister Anne. They talked about their childhood memories, about the times their mother had tried to give them normal experiences despite their royal status, and reminded him of the summer holidays when the Queen would organize treasure hunts around Balmoral, writing clues in her own handwriting. She had wanted them to know the estate, to understand why this place was so special to their family. When they returned to the castle, Charles spent time alone with his mother. He talked to her about everything: his children, his work with the Prince's Trust, his environmental projects that she had always supported even when others called them too radical. He told her about William and Kate's children, her great-grandchildren who adored their gone. He shared funny stories about little George, Charlotte, and Louis that made him smile even in this difficult moment. The Queen's eyes would occasionally flutter open, and Charles felt sure she could hear him. He told her about the letters and cards from around the world that had poured in during her Platinum Jubilee celebrations earlier that year. People from every corner of the Commonwealth had written to thank her for her service. He described the joy on people's faces during the Jubilee weekend, how they had cheered for her appearance on the balcony at Buckingham Palace. As the afternoon progressed, other family members took turns sitting with the Queen. Charles watched his children, William and Harry, hold their grandmother's hands and whisper their own private goodbyes. Despite their recent family tensions, this moment brought them together in shared love for the remarkable woman who had shaped all their lives. Charles thought about the conversation he had had with his mother just a few months earlier about the Commonwealth leadership. She had expressed her hope that he would continue to serve as head of the Commonwealth when the time came. He had promised her he would, but now he understood the full weight of that promise. It wasn't just about holding a title. It was about maintaining the relationships and trust she had built over decades. The doctors checked on the Queen regularly, but there was nothing more they could do except ensure her comfort. Charles appreciated their discretion and kindness. They treated her not just as a patient, but with the respect due to someone who had given her entire adult life to public service. The head of the medical team had served the royal family for years and understood the delicate balance between medical care and dignity. Evening approached with unusual speed. Charles realized he hadn't eaten all day, but food seemed unimportant. His private secretary had been handling calls and arrangements, keeping the outside world at bay, while the family focused on these final hours together. Charles knew that once the news broke, everything would change dramatically, but for now, Balmoral remained their private sanctuary. The Queen's lady-in-waiting, who had served her faithfully for decades, sat quietly in the corner of the room. Charles saw tears in her eyes and realized that this loss would ripple through hundreds of people who had worked with and loved his mother. She had been not just a monarch, but an employer, colleague, and friend to so many. As the sun began to set over the Scottish hills, Charles held his mother's hand and made silent promises to her. He would honor her legacy. He would serve the people as she had taught him. He would try to bring the same sense of duty and compassion to the role that she had demonstrated for 70 years. Most importantly, he would remember that being king was not about personal power, but about being a servant to others. The room was filled with a profound sense of peace. Despite the sadness, Charles felt grateful for these precious hours. His mother was surrounded by love, in the place she cherished most, with her family close by. It was, he realized, exactly how she would have chosen to spend her final day. At 6:30 in the evening on September 8th, 2022, Queen Elizabeth II passed away peacefully at Balmoral Castle. Charles was holding her hand when she drew her last breath. The room was quiet except for the gentle ticking of the antique clock on the mantelpiece. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. The longest-serving monarch in British history had completed her remarkable journey. Charles felt an overwhelming mixture of emotions wash over him. Grief for the loss of his beloved mother, but also a profound sense of responsibility. In that instant, he became King Charles III. The words, "The Queen is dead. Long live the King," echoed in his mind, carrying centuries of tradition and the weight of his new role. The immediate hours that followed were a carefully orchestrated process that had been planned for decades. Operation London Bridge, the code name for the protocols following the Queen's death, swung into action. Charles's private secretary made the first crucial calls to the Prime Minister, the Archbishop of Canterbury, and the Commonwealth leaders. Each conversation was brief, but carried enormous significance. Charles requested a few moments alone with his mother before the formal procedures began. He looked at her peaceful face and whispered a final goodbye. She looked serene, as if she had simply fallen asleep after a long day of faithful service. He touched her hand once more, remembering all the times those hands had comforted him, guided him, and blessed others through her 7 decades of reign. The family gathered together in the drawing room, supporting each other through this profound loss. Charles found himself automatically taking charge, comforting his siblings and children while dealing with his own grief. It was a role he had been preparing for his entire life, but the reality felt overwhelming. And, ever practical, helped coordinate the immediate arrangements while William and Harry stood together, temporarily putting aside their differences in the face of shared sorrow. Charles knew that within hours, the news would spread around the world. Flags would be lowered to half-mast, television programs would be interrupted, and millions of people would mourn alongside the royal family. His mother had touched so many lives during her reign, from world leaders to ordinary citizens who had met her during walkabouts and royal visits. The evening brought a procession of important calls that Charles had to take as the new monarch. The Prime Minister, Liz Truss, offered her condolences and discussed the immediate constitutional requirements. The Archbishop of Canterbury shared prayers and spoke about the memorial services that would follow. Each conversation reminded Charles that his private grief would have to be balanced with his public duties. Charles spent time that evening writing his first statement as king. He wanted his words to honor his mother's memory while also setting the tone for his own reign. He thought carefully about how to express the nation's loss while providing comfort to the millions who would be grieving alongside him. The statement needed to acknowledge his mother's extraordinary legacy while looking forward to his own service to the country and Commonwealth. The castle staff, who had served the Queen faithfully for decades, were deeply affected by the news. Charles took time to speak with them personally, thanking them for their care and dedication to his mother. Many had been with the royal household for their entire careers, and they were losing not just their employer, but someone they had come to love and respect deeply. As night fell over Balmoral, Charles realized this was his last evening as Prince of Wales. Tomorrow, he would return to London as king, facing a schedule of ceremonial duties and constitutional responsibilities. The Accession Council would formally proclaim him as king, and he would make his first address to the nation as the new monarch. He walked through the castle rooms where his mother had spent her happiest times. Her reading glasses were still on the table next to her favorite chair. Her jigsaw puzzle, which she had been working on that week, remained unfinished on a side table. These small, personal details made her absence feel even more real and poignant. Charles thought about the thousands of engagements his mother had carried out during her reign. She had met every U.S. president from Truman to Biden, witnessed the end of the British Empire and the rise of the modern Commonwealth, and guided the country through decades of change. Now it was his turn to provide that steady, reassuring presence for the nation. The constitutional wheels were already turning. In the coming days, there would be the formal proclamation, meetings with government officials, and preparations for the state funeral. But tonight, Charles allowed himself to be simply a son who had lost his mother. Tomorrow, the full weight of kingship would settle on his shoulders. But for these final hours, he could grieve privately for the remarkable woman who had shaped his life and inspired his dedication to service. Before going to bed, Charles stepped outside onto the Balmoral terrace where his mother had spent so many peaceful evenings. The Scottish air was crisp and clear, and the stars seemed unusually bright. He felt her presence strongly in this place she had loved so much, and He made a silent promise that he would honor her memory through his own service to the people she had loved and served so faithfully. The following morning, Charles woke early in his mother's beloved Balmoral, but everything had changed. He was no longer the Prince of Wales waiting for his destiny. He was King Charles III, with immediate responsibilities weighing on his shoulders. The Scottish morning mist seemed fitting for such a solemn day, wrapping the castle in a gentle shroud that matched the mood of quiet grief. Charles's first official duty as king was to return to London, but he insisted on taking a final walk around the Balmoral grounds where his mother had found such peace and joy. He visited her favorite spots, the spot by the river where she loved to fish, the garden where she had planted trees to mark special occasions, and the stables where she had kept her beloved horses and ponies. Each location held precious memories of a woman who found genuine happiness in the simple pleasures of country life. The helicopter journey south was filled with mixed emotions. Charles watched the Scottish landscape disappear below, knowing his mother would never see these hills again. At the same time, he felt the pull of duty drawing him toward London, where crowds had already begun gathering outside Buckingham Palace, leaving flowers and messages of condolence. The weight of a nation's expectations was becoming real. Arriving at Buckingham Palace as king for the first time was profoundly moving. Charles had visited this building thousands of times throughout his life, but now he was returning as its principal resident and the symbol of the monarchy his mother had served so faithfully. The staff lined up to greet him, many with tears in their eyes, all pledging their continued service to the crown. The Accession Council meeting at St. James's Palace was Charles's first major constitutional duty as king. Standing before the privy councillors, including government ministers, senior judges, and Commonwealth representatives, he took the oath to serve his people and preserve the Church of England. The ancient words carried new weight when spoken by someone who had just lost his mother and gained a kingdom in the span of 24 hours. Charles's first address to the nation as king was broadcast that evening. He had spent hours crafting his words, wanting to strike the right balance between personal grief and public reassurance. He spoke from his heart about his mother's extraordinary legacy, calling her my darling mama, and acknowledging the deep personal loss felt by the entire royal family. But he also looked forward, promising to serve with the same dedication and sense of duty that she had demonstrated. In his speech, Charles paid tribute to his mother's unswerving devotion to duty and her promise, made on her 21st birthday, that her whole life would be devoted to service. He spoke about how she had fulfilled that promise beyond measure, giving her entire adult life to the service of others. These weren't just ceremonial words. They reflected his deep understanding of the sacrifice his mother had made and his own commitment to continue that tradition. The days following the Queen's death were filled with ancient ceremonies and modern media coverage. Charles found himself navigating between private grief and public duty, sometimes struggling to maintain his composure during official events while cameras captured every moment. The sight of his mother's coffin being carried from Balmoral to Edinburgh was particularly difficult, marking the beginning of her final journey. Throughout this period, Charles drew strength from the thousands of messages pouring in from around the world. World leaders, ordinary citizens, and representatives from the 54 Commonwealth countries shared their memories of his mother and offered support for his new role. The global outpouring of love and respect for the Queen helped Charles understand the true scope of her impact on the world. The period of official mourning became a time for Charles to reflect on his mother's legacy while preparing for his own reign. He met with government officials, Commonwealth representatives, and religious leaders, all while planning the state funeral that would become one of the largest gatherings of world leaders in history. Each meeting reinforced the enormous responsibility he had inherited. Charles also spent private time with his family, supporting his children and grandchildren through their grief while dealing with his own loss. The Queen had been not just a monarch, but a beloved grandmother to William, Harry, and their children. Charles watched his grandchildren struggle to understand that Gone wouldn't be there for future birthday parties and Christmas celebrations. During quiet moments, Charles found himself thinking about the promises he had made to his mother over the years. She had always emphasized that monarchy was about service, not privilege. She had shown him that a king's role was to unite people, not divide them, and to provide stability and continuity in times of change. These lessons, learned over decades of observation and conversation, would guide him as he stepped into his new role. The weight of history was everywhere during those first days as king. Charles was now the head of an institution that had lasted for over 1,000 years, and he was responsible for adapting it for the modern world while preserving its essential character. His mother had successfully navigated the monarchy through enormous changes during her 70-year reign, and now it was his turn to guide it into the future. As the preparations for the state funeral continued, Charles realized that this ceremony would be both an end and a beginning. It would mark the conclusion of his mother's remarkable life of service, but it would also be his first major state occasion as king. The world would be watching, and he was determined to ensure that the ceremony would be a fitting tribute to the woman who had given everything in service to others. September 19th, 2022, dawned crisp and clear in London, a perfect autumn morning for Queen Elizabeth II's state funeral. As Charles prepared for this most solemn of days, he reflected on how his mother would have appreciated the beautiful weather. She had always loved the changing seasons and found joy in nature's rhythms, something she had passed on to her eldest son. The funeral at Westminster Abbey would be attended by 2,000 people, including presidents, prime ministers, and royalty from around the world. But for Charles, the most important attendees were the ordinary people who had loved and served his mother, her household staff, charities workers, and representatives from the countless organizations she had supported during her 70-year reign. Charles had insisted that the funeral reflect his mother's personal faith and her commitment to service. The hymns chosen were among her favorites, including "The Lord's My Shepherd," which she had selected for her wedding to Prince Philip in 1947. The readings spoke of duty, faith, and the hope of eternal life, themes that had guided the Queen throughout her remarkable journey. Walking behind his mother's coffin through the streets of London was one of the most difficult moments of Charles's life. The weight of the crown imperial on the coffin seemed to symbolize the enormous responsibility that had now passed to him. Millions of people lined the route, many throwing flowers and calling out messages of love and support. Their genuine grief and affection for his mother was both heartbreaking and comforting. The Archbishop of Canterbury's sermon captured the essence of the Queen's life and faith. He spoke about her promise of lifelong service, made when she was just 21 years old, and how she had kept that promise for more than 7 decades. Charles felt tears welling in his eyes as he heard his mother's dedication described so eloquently. These were the qualities he now needed to embody as king. The moment when the last post played and the 2-minute silence began was profoundly moving. Across the United Kingdom and throughout the Commonwealth, millions of people stood in respectful silence, united in their tribute to a woman who had been a constant presence in their lives. Charles used those 2 minutes to say his own final goodbye to his mother, thanking her for everything she had taught him about duty, service, and love. The committal service at St. George's Chapel, Windsor, was more intimate and personal. This was where his mother would be laid to rest alongside Prince Philip, her beloved husband of 73 years. Charles had chosen this smaller setting for family and close friends to share more personal memories and prayers. The Queen had always preferred Windsor to the grandeur of Buckingham Palace, finding peace in its more homely atmosphere. When the crown, orb, and scepter were removed from the coffin, Charles felt the symbolic transfer of power in a deeply personal way. These were the same regalia he would use at his own coronation, continuing an unbroken line of service that stretched back centuries. His mother had worn that crown with grace and dignity, and now it was his responsibility to do the same. The private burial that evening was limited to the closest family members. As they gathered around the grave, where his mother would rest beside Prince Philip, Charles spoke briefly about the woman they had all loved in different ways, as queen, mother, grandmother, and great-grandmother. He thanked her for the example she had set and promised to honor her memory through his own service to the nation and Commonwealth. In the weeks that followed the funeral, Charles began to establish his own routine as king. He held his first weekly audience with the prime minister, started his regular review of government papers, and began planning his coronation. But each day, he carried with him the lessons his mother had taught him about putting duty before personal preference and finding joy in service to others. Letters and messages continued to pour in from around the world, sharing memories of encounters with the Queen and expressing support for the new king. Charles was amazed by the stories people told, how his mother had remembered personal details from previous meetings, how she had shown genuine interest in their lives and work, and how her presence had brought dignity and importance to their special occasions. Charles established new traditions while honoring old ones. He continued his mother's practice of sending personal messages to people celebrating their 100th birthdays, but he also expanded the environmental initiatives that had been his passion as Prince of Wales. He saw this as honoring his mother's adaptability. She had always evolved with the times while maintaining core values. The first Christmas broadcast as king was particularly meaningful. Charles spoke from St. George's Chapel, where his mother had been buried just 3 months earlier. He honored her memory while looking forward to his own reign, emphasizing the importance of service, community, and faith values that had guided the Queen throughout her extraordinary life. As Charles settled into his role as king, he often found himself asking what his mother would have done in various situations. Her wisdom continued to guide him, even in her absence. He realized that the greatest tribute he could pay to her was not just to remember her fondly, but to continue the work she had started and to serve with the same dedication and grace that had made her beloved around the world. The Queen's legacy lived on not just in the institution of the monarchy, but in the countless lives she had touched, the charities she had supported, and the example she had set for future generations. Charles understood that his role was to build on that foundation, adapting the monarchy for the modern world while preserving the timeless values of service, duty, and love that his remarkable mother had embodied so completely. Her greatest tribute would be a monarchy that continued to serve and inspire, just as she had done for 7 decades of unwavering devotion.